Here we are. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, everyone. Wow, so the new starting page is getting even more groovy. Has all the links
I'm
on it.
I'm sophisticated like that. And I'll show that again at the end of the broadcast so that people know different places they can follow us.
Right.
Uh,
Well, hey,
yeah, so
Connie.
people are already saying good morning. Good morning, Connie. So
Yeah.
in this episode, we're talking about Saint Benedict and what he did and how that might be helpful for us to consider during this time of our own imperial decline.
Right. Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. So very briefly, so Benedict was one of actually a number of people. Um, Good morning, Heather. Was one of a number of people who in the mid kind of 5th century of the Common Era, began to set up these very, very small intentional communities. And of course, the Roman Empire at that point was in a state of decline. You had all kinds of various other groups and populations kind of chomping away at the edges of the empire. The imperial court and the situation in Rome was becoming more and more decrepit, having been pretty decrepit for a long time, but it was just kind of getting worse and worse. You had this very significant movement called that we now call the Desert Mothers and Fathers, of all these people going out into the wilderness in North Africa and what we now call Syria and Palestine, to essentially try to relate directly to God, to become more holy people. And that movement was initially sort of a hermit movement, but it was becoming more of a communal movement as time went on, basically because most people aren't really called to be hermits. And so you then had the creation of these small communities. And Benedict in particular found this broken down house in northern Italy. And he and his pals just moved in there to, as he called it, try to create a school for the Lord. And the idea was, again, to create what we today might call a sane community or a healthy community, a holy community. And of course, they didn't have any great expectation that this was going to fix the Roman Empire or overthrow Caesar or anything like that. But they felt like it was the one thing that they could do and control. And it was a primary focus for them to center their lives around. And of course, it then started this very long movement that we now know as the Benedictine spirituality, the Benedictine tradition. Of course, they didn't know at the time that that was going to happen and that they were going to be successful. Um, and so one of the things to me that's particularly interesting about that right now, why I've been thinking about this a lot, is because as time goes on with this pandemic, particularly here in the United States, it really feels to me, and I'm not the only one, I just actually read another article about this morning before we jumped on, that we're just in kind of free fall. That the federal response to this is kind of a catastrophe and just ongoing state of chaos, and that people are really feeling adrift and afloat in many ways.
Hmm.
And so it seems like it would be useful to think about, okay, what are different models for what people who are concerned with doing good in the world, what do they do in response to kind of a wider disintegration?
Hmm. I mean, this is interesting that to me, like this sort of thinking about monasticism and different approaches. I mean, it kind of comes and goes. When people rediscover this, like with, at least within Protestantism, within Catholicism, it's never, it doesn't come and go. It just goes.
Uh-oh. Mark is frozen. Just to let everybody know, Mark's been having some trouble with his internet over there at the house. And so, speaking of coming and going, internet connection seems to have gone at this point. I don't know whether that's interrupting the wider transmission or whether or not it's just interrupting Mark. Are you back?
Yeah, we'll find out. I think I'm back. I mean, I've been here this whole time. So we'll see how it comes out. I mean, I don't want to start talking about my internet issues, but for those watching, Xfinity kind of sucks. So if you can get something else, do it.
Right.
Because I'm paying for the best plan that you can get from Xfinity, and it doesn't seem to do any good to pay all that extra. But there's been this sort of usually this sort of new monasticism sort of impulse has been among more progressive-minded people, but this Rod Dreher Benedict adoption stuff is more of the conservative, like let's withdraw from society sort of response. So it's interesting, the two different ways of looking at Benedict and the Benedictine tradition. Like you can look at it from a very conservative perspective of like, oh, let's just withdraw from the world, or you can look at it in a more maybe liberatory or radical perspective about how to engage the world differently.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, to me, a lot of the, I don't know, the difference in that or the orientation, it has to do with, am I looking at it sort of from the outside relative to the big whole, or am I looking at it from the inside of what can I just do in my life, right? Like, how can I empower myself in my life? And I think that, when you read the Rule of Benedict and you read other people who are part of that tradition, what I see and hear much more is that inside out perspective. It's not like, oh, I'm intentionally leaving society. I mean, there's some of that, certainly, but it really is much more about, no, what do I want to do with my life, right? Like, how do I want to empower myself to live? And especially, and we were talking about this yesterday as we were thinking about this episode a little bit. You see, when there are often these large societal calamities, there is a kind of concomitant rise in spiritual community. That again, when people look around and they see, general chaos, whether because of an illness or social upheaval or whatever it is, they say, all right, well, all I can do is this kind of small thing with myself and my community, and that's maybe the best choice, right? And so that is very liberating because it's very empowering. It's sort of taking personal power kind of back from the normal notion of, okay, I'm a citizen in this functional country or society, and so, the personal power is not as much immediate. I'm not really taking this radical agency over my own life.
It seems that I'm kind of curious about other times. So, this sort of pitting or recognizing that these movements come up during times like this. I mean, since if we look through the Christian history of other opportunities that have been like other times this has happened. I wonder if you have thoughts about other ones of those, because I mean, this seems to happen more often than we've
Right.
been at societal decline
Right.
a fair number of times.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I mean, we were talking about the Middle Ages yesterday, and I do think, and I don't have the reference for it, but I think that somebody has actually written an article that a number of folks have seen, kind of comparing what the Black Death did to feudal society to what this pandemic is going to do to capitalist society.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly during the Middle Ages, right? So if we look at the kind of 10th through 13th century, there was a huge rise in all kinds of very interesting creative movements. Some of them were just revivals of certain Benedictine communities and other orders, but some of them were new movements. So, for example, the Beguines, which was this very spontaneous group rise in these. There were women who they didn't actually want to form an order. I mean, that's what was really interesting about them and was very creative. So they didn't want to just become a group of nuns in a particular already existing order. They just wanted to get together and live a holy life of service.
Mm-hmm.
And this was mostly in what we now call Belgium, the sort of lowlands. And they just started forming these little houses in cities and communities. And they had some people that were particular teachers. And and they just want to live this life and again be of service to people around them in these very challenging times. And so I think that I feel like it's just a very kind of natural response. And again, one of the things that it's interesting, the phases that we're going through now in this pandemic, but now this phase that we're at is I'm talking to more and more people who are kind of in this state of like, okay, what the fuck happens now? Right? It's like, all right, we're lifting all these sheltering in place orders. There's obviously no clue about how to organize this. I'm seeing more people go out and about. Nobody still seems to know much of anything.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that I'm hearing from health people is like, all right, there's now going to be more disease and death. Like, what do we do, right? And there's this feeling of being lost, and just and then you see people posting stuff like, okay, guys, here's some helpful things. Like, this is you got to figure your own stuff out. And I think that's the state at which people start to say, all right, I need to empower myself to figure out what kind of life I want to lead, because there's, it's like there's nobody coming, right? The cavalry isn't coming, the fire department, whoever you think should be coming to be of help isn't coming. And so now I got to do this, and I have to find other people to do this with.
It's interesting. Paul has a question. Maybe you can talk about this, Dan. Are there specific Benedictine writings that would be contextually relevant to our desire for a non-hierarchical egalitarian society?
Yeah, I mentioned this book the other day, which was these papers that on the 900th anniversary of Bernard of Clairvaux, and that was Benedictine community, and so they got their papers together. This is how the monks party their 900th birthday. Woo-hoo. They write papers. And again, there's some really fascinating, very down-to-earth things in here. And problem is the book's really hard to get. But, I think just reading the Rule of St. Benedict is very fascinating, because, again, it's incredibly down to earth, right? I used that phrase twice. It's incredibly basic, in that, when you read it and you go through and you're like, gosh, he's talking about the monks putting the tools away. He's talking about how we eat together. He's talking about, You know, what are work hours like? And I think that what you see in that, right, what you see in that is this sense of, all right, we have to figure out how to lead this life together, right? Like larger society, whatever that is, isn't telling us how to do things in a good and healthy way. And so we have to figure this out. And, you know, it's kind of funny, right? Because in a way you would think like, well, everybody should know how to eat together, or everybody should know how to put their tools away. But it's like, no, we don't. And there's this parallel now where people are like, well, should I go out with masks? Should I wash my hands? Like, what do I do? How do I function to, how do I function to live a good life?
Here's a great comment from Nathan.
Yeah,
congregational communities seem to be hardwired to seek market share. I mean, that's a great way of putting it, rather than be agencies centered around service to others. For those of us still loyal and bound to institutions, can congregations begin to change from the inside out? An example from history. I mean, this is the fascinating thing. Like, and part of it, I've been thinking about how we tell history. We act as though the Middle Ages were just a shit show, and then all of a sudden the Reformation happened, like where people realized the church is crap. They started doing amazing things on their own, and it's like, and the further you get away from religion, the better things get. That's kind of how it's presented, which isn't. That's not how it was. I mean, there's all sorts of movements, even the Reformation and Renaissance. All this stuff was very spiritually charged, but there are all these examples of communities pushing against the status quo, and we tend to not. There's not a lot of writings from the Beguines. The best writings we have, like Marguerite Porret or whatever, we have a little bit of her, but we know of her because she was burnt at the stake, right? So there's not, because like these women had the gall to live on their own, redistribute their wealth apart from the authority structures of the church. So I think that some of what happens is this: we're going to do something different in a time when there's pressure to conform. So like with Christianity at this moment, it seems like a good example of that. There's this logic of Christianity in our society that seems fairly dominant, and breaking from that is hard, but it makes sense. To start to even what Nathan said, like instead of like this market mentality of, oh, how do we get more attenders so we can have more of a profit base so that we can offer more goods and services, right, to how do we not do that, and instead figure out how we structure life together towards our common needs.
Well, yeah, and again, the Benedictine movement, Nathan, is actually a perfect example of this, because the contemplative Christian movement did not see itself as being disconnected from the institution of the church. The Benedictine and the spirituality movement saw itself as being reforming a church that had already become too tied to imperial Rome, right? And so they did not see themselves as sort of leaving the church or leaving the institution per se. What they saw themselves as is a group of people that wanted to reorient the church around basic spiritual transformation and living a holy life and encountering God. And so I think that any group or any congregation could theoretically do this. And again, I think what pushes us, right, is the wider dissolution of things, right? So, right now, I'm talking to lots of pastors who are just going like, well, what comes next? Like, how do we get back together? Why do we get back together? What's even the point of what we're doing? If we get back together and my choir's average age is 80 years old and they all die because they're singing within 2 feet of each other, is that a good thing? Like, do we want that? So, that the push to ask that question of what comes next and what do we do that's the impulse that I think leads to some of these very unique, transformative movements.
Mm-hmm.
And what does Heather say?
Fundamentals like how to safely breathe in community are not fundamental anymore. Pastors trying to reach consensus on masks are in crisis.
Right.
I mean, this keeps us from getting into the deeper thing. Like, I'm hoping that I feel like we're still having conversations that are in crisis mode, but part of what I'm seeing with these communities, which there are a myriad of these communities, they start asking the deeper questions instead of like, how do I react to, wait, the reason we can't live well now is because our assumptions are all flawed and we need to chart a new way of living.
Right.
And some do a great job at this and some of them don't. Like there's all kinds of examples of not great examples of this too.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. But I think that's, and that's that key. And that's, to me, again, when you look at the Rule of Benedict, what you see is that he very much starts with that very basic question of, what is the point of being alive and being human? Like, why do we do what we do? And I feel like these crises where there's this tremendous threat and sense of, dread and sense of, like, literally, if I go outside, I could die. That pushes us to say, okay, so what is the point of doing anything? Like, if now just going shopping is not fulfilling, especially if I can get this fatal disease, then for whatever time I do have here, what is the best thing that I can do? And again, the spirituality answer is, the best thing that I can do is spend my time becoming more fully human and loving in the context of community. And Maria brings this up here. Throw up her comment there.
I find it very difficult to go against the grain of society by myself. I need the emotional support of others to have the long-term endurance to do things differently.
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was exactly what happened with the Desert Mothers and Fathers, was that people were finding that trying to live a spiritual life by yourself in a desert cave just did not work for the vast majority of people. And Benedict even mentions this in his rule and says, someday we might be able to go off into caves and be like the Desert Mothers and Fathers. But right now, we really need community to do this. And yeah, I mean, that's been reiterated over and over again.
Well, a lot of these communities are centered around economic life together, which, I mean, this comment kind of gets at this.
That's a big part of it.
Well, which churches, this is the thing I'm noticing with churches, maybe where I wish they'd do better. So Michelle writes, my kids haven't been out anywhere since the school bus brought them home on the last day of classes. The stay-in-place order is lifting in stages here in Ohio. To each his own on going out, but it's wrong not to provide income to people when there is an order saying that they can't work. I mean, that's, to me, like this sort of like the social inability, the government, society to provide has been a motivator for a lot of these communities. Like, we're gonna share our own resources. We're gonna do mutual aid. We're gonna do compassion for the poor, and then there's always a spillover effect. Like, one of my favorite examples of spiritual mutation, if we can call it that, is how the Franciscan spirituality, which is all about, living simply and loving. There's all these movements in Italy, like the Fraticelli, who are like, Francis is right, but we need to go further. We're gonna take down the Pope and the ruling authorities and start an egalitarian society by force of arms. And so there's these movements that start kind of seemingly and just generically spiritual, but they start asking deeper questions. And now, of course, the Fraticelli got wiped out. But to me, this is part of the point of that I'm raising here, is this question of, like, what does it mean to be human? How do we live in a way where we take care of each other? Always raises the bigger questions.
Yeah. And
always forces an issue.
Yeah.
So this idea that somehow spirituality, these people were just withdrawing.
No.
And not engaging the meat of reality is kind of something we tell ourselves now, but that wasn't what was happening.
Well, no, not at all. And, Michelle, to your point, I mean, this is exactly one of the things that drove these monastic movements, right? Is that, so the over the years, the biggest contribution to monastic communities were extra babies that starving families could not afford to feed, right? And so they would literally leave them on the doorsteps of the monasteries. And part of the impulse then of these monastic communities is, how do we take care of the population and the communities around us? I mean, one of the biggest questions we're facing right now is, what do 33 million people do right now? You know, I mean, for a while, the government can keep printing money, but at some point that is not going to work anymore. And so, so what do the people around us who, you know, can't work in airlines or stores or restaurants or all these different things, what are we going to do? And that is part of the impulse that helped founded these communities. You say, okay, well, let's find an abandoned house and some land, and let's start farming and have a few sheep and start making crafts. And oh yeah, by the way, we're also doing this contemplative life. But a big part of it is we have to take care of ourselves, because, you know, the society is collapsing, and yeah, there are no jobs.
And then, if we're going to take care of ourselves, we have to train ourselves for this new life. It's not just, which I've lived in community for almost 20 years now in some form or another. And you can't just slap people together and hope for the best. I mean, almost all of our problems come from bad habits of our broader society. And, you know, I'm an anarchist, so I don't like the idea of a centralized rule and authority. But at the same time, you have to have a way of training and shaping new life together that doesn't just hope for the best. Here's a comment from Daniel. I'm remembering a quote by Thomas Merton, who said something like, "Monasticism is the most successful and longest running socialist experiment in history."
Yeah, which is absolutely true. Yeah, and so I think that to me, the scary leap, or the leap that is required to make this happen, right, is this leap of empowerment, right? Because, you know, again, the dissolution of society is scary. I mean, it really is. You know, there are days when I wake up and I'm like, okay, what if things really start to fall apart even more? Like, that is terrifying. There are these moments of existential terror. And the response to that is very naturally to say and to hope, oh, I hope everything glues back together the way that it was, right? But when we recognize, like, oh no, things really are dissolving, and to then take that leap, both individuals and communities, to empower ourselves to say, all right, we're going to start working on a different way. Like, we may be doing some of our other things too, but we need to take this in our hands. We need to start making decisions. We need forming the way a new community might look. That's the very challenging leap, and that's the leap that, you know, these various figures that we're talking about made, and it was very empowering in their own lives. But it was also then historically very empowering for humanity as a whole. Now, Paul's got a fancy word for what I just described.
I don't even know how to pronounce that. Ataxophobia.
Ataxophobia. Isn't that the fear of taxes? No, I guess it's the fear of chaos.
It's a fear.
Yes.
It's a fear of being attacked.
It's a fear of being attacked by taxes.
We're in this moment where there's a lot of chaos and there's a lot of fear. And I mean, the part of the wisdom of this is, of what we're talking about, is we can start trying to be proactive about structuring life together that doesn't assume we'll be just taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You know, right. and that instead of just waiting, being in a holding pattern, stuck, like wondering what's going to happen, and there's some level of self-determination we can pool together and say, what is the good life? What is the good life? What is it supposed to look like? And how can maybe a handful of us try to pursue that together? It doesn't necessarily mean starting a monastery, but I mean, there's simple things like sharing what resources we have, like with tools or whatever. There's all kinds of experiments throughout history of people doing some level of community.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is recognizing that this is not a unique moment, right? That this has happened before, that people have responded to this in various ways, and that, and you use that word wisdom, Mark, that there is a lot of wisdom out there that we can engage and we can garner. And really, in some ways, all it takes is us beginning to ask these questions for ourselves. Like, all right, what is important in life? If I had to give a little elevator speech of what is really important to me in life, and the more that we can begin to do that and focus on that, and then engage others in that conversation, that sets in motion a whole process of transformation that's very interesting. All right, so we've made it through tech issues and all, and actually it's a great segue because we're excited. We've got a guest coming tomorrow. You want to say something about that, Mark?
Yeah, so Ceres Villanueva is joining us tomorrow to talk about activist culture, because this comes up a lot. The different ways that even the people, when we're trying to challenge the system, we still have the pathologies of the system within us. And so we're, every once in a while when we talk about things like this, Ceres chimes in with great comments. So we're invited her to be a part of a conversation about activism and activist culture during, in general, but also during this time of pandemic.
Yeah, and she lives out in LA. We're getting a report from Los Angeles, my hometown, small town out west, as I like to say.
I've heard of it. Yeah, I've heard of that place.
Yeah, a few people have. So, all right. Thanks for listening. Thanks for the great comments and watching, and thanks for being patient through our tech issues. We'll see you next time.